about this definition, and sort of picking right up on the last panel, is this definition of entrepreneurship does not limit itself to Stanford kids in skinny jeans and T-shirts, right? And I think that's actually something that's really magical about Tech Cocktail now partnering with CTA, right? Because entrepreneurship and CTA making the decision to work with TechCo, I think is a great reflection of this, right? It's not just some startup, but it's American Airlines or NASA. And so I think that's great. And I've tried to really spend my time, right after I dropped out of Carnegie Mellon, because that's what you do when you're an entrepreneur. So I dropped out of CMU. I did 3 startups. And each of those, I can look at them and I can say, like, wow, that startup, they each made some money for me. But more importantly, right, they made the world the way it ought to be. So we built and sold 3 of those. Towards the end of the 3rd one, I started spending time back at Carnegie Mellon and spending time with students trying to convince them to do the same thing. And basically, I now spend all of my time trying to convince people to make the world the way it ought to be by doing startups. Some of those people I try to convince to do it are students of mine. Some of them are portfolio companies. I also run the executive education program at CMU for corporate exec ed and try to teach them to be what they call entrepreneurial, or what I would just call entrepreneurial, right? And as Frank mentioned, I wrote a book. And I was thinking about the fact that that's what I do, and I was reflecting back on when I was a grad student at Carnegie Mellon before I dropped out. And I had this curmudgeon-y professor who's still a professor there, so I won't give you his name. But he leaned back in his chair one day and he said, "So Sean, what do you want to do like when you grow up?" And I thought, oh, this is great. He's going to give me like really great advice. So I said, "I want to be an entrepreneur when I grow up." And he's like, "Well, that is a terrible idea. It's just an awful idea. You should not do this." And I was like 22 years old, and I was completely distraught that this guy who I really respected was like, "Do not be an entrepreneur." And he said, "Let me tell you the statistics about being an entrepreneur." He said, "You know, they did this research, and it's this. I think the research he referenced was from Dun & Bradstreet. I don't remember, but they said that companies that are started, 1 out of 5 of those companies will still be around a year after they get started, and of the one that makes it out of year 1, 1 out of those 5 will be around 4 more years later." He said, "So if you want to be an entrepreneur, you're basically asking for signing up to doing something with a 4% success rate." And as a cocky 22-year-old, I said, "Yeah, but I'll be in that 4%. And now I'm back at CMU, and I was with him a couple weeks ago, and I was like, "See, I did it 3 times in a row. I was at 4% 3 times in a row." Now, the reason I tell this story is it's not just that I think this was the misconception about entrepreneurship at the time. By the way, I think the stats are terrible for a variety of reasons. So like looking at the number of people who request Dun & Bradstreet numbers, that's kind of like if you logged into your favorite domain registrar, right? And you're like, "Oh, look at all the domains I registered on GoDaddy. I have all these .me and .co domains." That's not actually starting a company. That's just like, "Oh, I might someday want to do something like that." Requesting a Dun & Bradstreet number is a terrible proxy for people who want to be entrepreneurs. But this is how higher ed looked at entrepreneurship at the time. And how things have changed. So this is research that I haven't published yet, but I did with 2 colleagues of mine. So we went out and we surveyed 200 and some different entrepreneurship programs across the country, and the directors at those schools. And we asked them, how has student interest in entrepreneurship changed over the last 2 years? And let me tell you, you'll never actually ask faculty at universities and get this consistent a response about anything. I think you could ask them, like, is water safe to drink? You might not get 95 or 85% of them to tell you that basically the same answer. So you've got basically 85% that say it's either significantly increased or slightly increased. 11% said there's been no meaningful change, and 3.5% that say it's slightly decreased. And literally out of 200 and some professors, none of them said the interest has significantly decreased. Right? And this is true. So like when I was a grad student, the reason I tell you this, or show you this day, is when I was a grad student, entrepreneurship, ugly redheaded stepchild of higher ed. Today, not at all. People pick the schools they go to based on how good the entrepreneurship programs are there. And this leads to a really important question, right? How do you actually teach people to be entrepreneurs? And there's lots of different philosophies on this, right? So some people will tell you, like, well, you actually can't teach entrepreneurship. That's really disheartening to me and not what I believe at all. So I come out on the other extreme end of that, which is I believe everybody wants to be entrepreneurial. They may not want to do a startup. They may have different kind of risk tolerance, but everybody wants to make the world the way the world ought to be. And so as I've been teaching now, back at CMU teaching for 5 or 6 years, I've spent a lot of time trying to talk to other people about how you teach it. And one of the things we've landed on is like, look, you can't teach somebody to come up with ideas, but what you can teach them to do is you can say, look, these are the processes and the best practices that entrepreneurship programs, that entrepreneurs who have been successful, this is what they've done. And then you can say, go out immediately and try to apply those. So in all the classes we teach in entrepreneurship at CMU, we make people apply the best practices like within a week of learning them. So we have these things called application exercises. And if you have a real startup idea, you can apply these against your startup idea. If you don't, make up some crazy idea. So and just get practice doing it. And then the third element that you can do to teach entrepreneurship is you can expose them to different case studies that help them see what success looks like from other entrepreneurs who've come before them. And even if that felt a little dry to you, you've probably read one or both of these books, right? And I happily stole from both these books to create Carnegie Mellon's graduate course on lean entrepreneurship, right? So this is Steve Blank's and Eric's book, right? And so even if you're not familiar with what I just said, if you've read these books, right, this is how you teach entrepreneurship. And it's working really well. And actually, I would argue that this is one of the things that's made entrepreneurship not have a 4% success rate beyond how bogus that stat is. We've gotten better at doing entrepreneurship because of these books teaching people how to take an idea and commercialize it. And so all over Carnegie Mellon, every Monday night for about 5-6 years now, I've taken these methods and taught the Lean Entrepreneurship course there. And basically told students at the beginning of the course, what we're going to do in this course is we're going to help you go from an idea that you have to product market fit, right? And at a conference like this, I don't need to define product market fit for you, but the idea, right, is just we're going to help you go from just some great idea to knowing that idea actually solves a real problem for somebody, and that group of people who you're solving it for is large enough that can build a business that you aspire to build. And I actually think it's been just a fantastic thing. I added these slides because I had a chance this morning to spend some time with a bunch of the startups here, and I thought, look, if there's anything from just the lean stuff that I would want an entrepreneur to walk away with. And so I thought I would, so I love the lean startup. I love this concept of launching and this idea of these minimally viable products and services, right? Or this idea that you release a product, you get feedback on it, you learn from the feedback that you get, and you iterate. And this is sort of I like to call this kind of the flux capacitor of the lean startup. I think Eric originally called it that. For me, that's exactly my age. For some of you, that might be, that might make me old. But anyways, if you remember Back to the Future, right, this is sort of the core of the lean startup, right? And I think it's really great. The thing to remember here are a couple of things, though. One, this is a cycle or a loop, right? So you don't raise $500,000 to get an MVP, or you don't release an MVP and then scale up, right? You iterate, you release your MVP, you learn from that release, you release your next MVP, you learn from it. So it's an iterative process. And the other thing that I think a lot of entrepreneurs forget when they're taught this is they hear the word viable and they think the word crappy, right? They're like, let me show you my MVP. And they show it to you and you're like, oh. And I had a chance with the Kauffman Foundation a couple years ago to go to Lisbon, Portugal, and this story, and this realization hit me square across the face. So I was doing office hours in Lisbon, Portugal with a bunch of different entrepreneurs, and I had two entrepreneurs walk into the office hours with me, and they both had just been the best men in each other's weddings, and they sat down, and to the panel before, they had gotten the advice that it's good to start talking to a VC with a provocative statement. So they sat down and they said, the process of getting married is broken. And I was like, wow, this is, it got my attention, right? I, at the time, was happily married. I was like, I'm actually kind of a big fan of being married for what it's worth. What do you mean by the process of getting married is broken? And they said, well, Sean, the thing about when you get married, the thing about the process of getting married is that you end up spending a lot of time talking to your fiance about really important questions in their mind, like, should we use beige tissue paper or off-white tissue paper in the wedding invitation? And they said the problem with that conversation, Sean, is that beige and off-white are actually the same color. And again, I want to be clear. This is their experience, not mine. I was selling a business in the middle of getting married, so I didn't even weigh in on beige versus off-white. But so they said, and the problem is, like, if you say I don't care, which is the appropriate response to which of these two colors do you want when it's the same color, the problem is that your spouse hears, your future spouse hears, you don't care about, like, the kids you're going to have, what school they're going to go to, which college you're going to pick for them, right? And so they said, so then you end up fighting about beige versus off-white tissue paper. And so at this point, they'd done a really nice job kind of framing the problem. And I said, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. And these guys were Eric Ries fanboys. I'm telling you, like, they had the Lean Startup book with them. It was like dog-eared. There were like pages folded down. I think they may have slept with Eric's book under their pillow so that by osmosis they could learn more of his wisdom. And I said, okay. And so sort of seeing this, and I said, well, what did you do as an MVP to, test out this idea of, fixing the process of getting married, or this sort of weddings are broken? And they said, well, we built a landing page. And I was like, okay, that makes a ton of sense to me. What were you trying to validate with the landing page? And they said, well, we looked at kind of two different ways we could approach solving this problem. We built a landing page, and we wanted to see which response was better. And I was like, and I said, like, genuinely, with real interest, as they framed out the two ideas they had, I said, well, which one got a higher response rate? And they said, well, they both got a 0% response rate. And I was like, a 0% response rate? Well, how much money did you spend? And they'd spent the equivalent of thousands of US dollars driving traffic to this page. And I'm telling you, I've built a lot of landing pages to test different ideas out over the time. I could build a landing page that said, I'm a Somalian prince. Please enter your social security number here. And if I spent thousands of dollars on it, you would get better than a 0% response rate on that, right? It actually is the right acronym, by the way. You are building a map, right? You're not building a destination, you're building a map. So anyways, just a quick thought. But overall, huge fan of the Lean Startup, right? I think it's absolutely incredible and a great way to go from idea to product market fit. But as I've been teaching this for years and years at CMU, I had this robotics master's student of mine take my course. His name was Spencer. And Spencer was the kind of student, maybe you were like Spencer in school. If not, you certainly knew people like Spencer. Spencer was the kind of guy who really didn't care like what everybody else in the class wanted to know. He had questions that he wanted answered, and he was going to get them answered, independent of what I hoped to cover that night, what other students might want to learn. And he was relatively kind of socially unaware of the fact that that didn't make sense. He's totally brilliant. He's an incredibly brilliant roboticist. He's actually on the Uber Advanced Technology Center team now, building self-driving cars in Pittsburgh. But he was a little bit of a challenge through the semester. So we were walking out at the end of the semester, and Spencer said to me, Sean, that was a great class, probably the best class I took at Carnegie Mellon. And like, I am feeling great, right? Because Spencer, lots of students will say that to me with the hope of getting an A. I'm fairly confident Spencer couldn't have connected the dot between give the professor a compliment, I'll get a better grade. I'm like, wow. I said, thank you. That is incredibly great to hear. He goes, but, and I was like, oh, here it comes. He goes, but it was a total waste of time. I was like, well, I'm thinking in my head, like, that's more the kind of feedback given the semester I've just had with you, I would expect. I said, well, Spencer, why was it a waste of time? I'm thinking, because genuinely, they pay me less than I would make flipping hamburgers at Wendy's to teach here. And I've got this day job as a VC. Like, there are other things I could do with my time other than waste my time and yours. And before I got defensive, I remembered something that if you've read any of the Lean Startup stuff or you've been around this space, you hear all the time, right? Which is that all feedback is a gift. And I reminded myself that I've been spending an entire semester with Spencer telling him all feedback from customers is a gift. And the reality is that Spencer's paying $50,000 a year to get his graduate degree. He is the customer. I said, well, why was it a waste of time? And he said, well, here's the problem. Like, for a number of us, because of visa issues, which thankfully have since then we're on a path to fixing, or because of student debt, many of us are not going to actually take an idea and try to commercialize it when we graduate. What we're actually trying to figure out is, how do you go from product market fit to scale? And as I sat and kind of reflected on that over the next weeks and reminded myself over and again, like, all feedback's a gift, I realized how really true that is, because entrepreneurs don't do entrepreneurship to get to product market fit. I've never had an entrepreneur come into my office and pitch me on their startup and say, what I really want to do is develop a product that could satisfy the needs of a good market, right? That I've proven could do that. What you want to do is you want to make the world the way it ought to be, right? And so I started thinking, well, I'm nothing if not lazy intelligently, so I will find the equivalent of Steve and Eric's book for scaling up startups, and I'll just create a second course at CMU that's called, like, whatever that book title is called. And I read a bunch of different books and was kind of frustrated with the advice that I read. And so, keeping with this theme of being lazy intelligently, I wasn't really happy with any of them. And so what I started doing is I started taking the best students from my lean entrepreneurship course, and the next semester doing independent studies with them, where we build out case studies of companies that were satisfying basically the same need in the same target market at about the same time, but one took off and one didn't. And this being Carnegie Mellon, they picked tech companies mostly, with the exception of one or two students actually across 2 semesters who were fascinated by restaurant and food innovation, and so they did McDonald's and White Castle. But everybody else up there are tech companies. And after a couple years of doing this, we started sort of looking at all the case studies and saying, like, well, are there any common trends that we could see across all these case studies? Why are, as the last panelist said, why are all the VCs driving Teslas and not Fiskars today, right? Or why is everybody in the Midwest, apparently I'm from Pittsburgh, so I don't know if I should take offense at this or not, but why is everybody from Pittsburgh on Facebook but not on Friendster today? Right, and so, so we started looking at these, and then we had some other ones where we had a hard time coming up with what the right contrast would be. So like Google, you either pick like 16 search engines or you just do Google, right? Or PayPal, they had the creative idea of merging the 2 companies that would have been the obvious pair of companies to draw. And we ended up coming up with a model, because again, how you teach entrepreneurship, right? Models and best practices. We came up with this model where we took those stories and we turned it into a course. And the course was all on how do you go from product market fit to scale. And the model is basically built around these 3 different phases that we saw these startups go through. The first phase was what we called the prerequisites, right? So what are the things you need to do before you start thinking about scale? So just like you can't do calculus before you do algebra, there are certain things that you need to satisfy before you can think about scaling, right? And you can think of these as sort of, and these are linear progressions, so you can think about the first one as really kind of problem founder fit, 2 and 3 is kind of product market fit, and then the 4th is excellent first interaction. The idea is, like, once you satisfied those first 3 prerequisites, how do you make sure that the first time someone picks up your product, they have this kind of magical first experience? And some of this is not, I would say a lot of this is not new. We're just trying to pull together using these case studies. So, this 4th point is really kind of crossing the chasm. When you move from innovators, early adopters to the rest of the market, the way the person interacts with that product becomes really, really important. The second thing, and this is what I thought I'd spend the next few minutes of the talk on, the second part of this is like, okay, once you've satisfied those prerequisites, how do you begin to help the world catch up with you? Right? Because if entrepreneurs create the world the way the world ought to be, one of the frustrating things about entrepreneurship is that it often takes the world a long time to realize that you're creating the world the way it ought to be. I think on the last panel when they were talking about the kind of why now trend, this is part of it. But the reality is there are things you can do to make people, to increase that awareness in a rapid way. So we call these catalyzing events, just like chemical catalysts, right? And the interesting thing about these is if you ask people later for company success stories, they'll often talk about the catalyzing events as when that startup launched, right? So if I were to ask you, when did Twitter launch, right? Maybe not in a room like this, but if you were even maybe at the path that's going on in parallel right now, if you were to ask a lot of them, it could be a fun cocktail game for you tonight at the party. So when did Twitter launch, right? Most people would say, oh, Twitter launched at South by Southwest. And referencing March of 2007, when Twitter set up the screens at South by Southwest and people started using it for the first time. The only problem, and that's a great story, right? It's a great story for South by Southwest. It's made that the Interactive Festival, a much more popular event to go to. As someone who went before and after that event. Like, it definitely changed the face of what the Interactive Festival looked like. It's also a great story for Twitter. So, the day Twitter went public, if you look at the Wall Street Journal coverage of Twitter that day, they talk about Twitter launching at this tech festival in Austin, Texas. The only problem with that is it's not true, right? So it's a great story. Unfortunately, it has this consequence of being completely false. And that's really negative, because then lots of other entrepreneurs think what they need to do to be successful is go to South by Southwest and like sprinkle some magic pixie dust on your startup, and it will also blow up. So it actually turned out Twitter had been around 9 months before that. Or if you ask people, so when did Airbnb launch? People will be like, oh, obviously it launched at Denver, at the Denver DNC convention when Obama accepted the nomination. Right? Makes sense, because that's probably where most people first heard about it. The problem is Airbnb had been around for a long time before that event. What happened in both of these cases, right, Twitter at South by Southwest and Airbnb at the DNC convention, is that there was this big problem, and this problem that was much larger than the platform itself, but that these platforms solved. And what happened is, by going and plugging themselves into that event, a lot of people became aware of it, right? So what's the big problem at South by Southwest? Where to get free beer, right, at the parties that night. Right, and it turns out that a short message to your cell phone on, hey, the Microsoft party is now giving away free beer, come get it there, and then, oh, you can go down the street. Right, it's a great way to do that, and also, I guess, find the right panels to attend during the day. How about Airbnb, right? So they make the decision to move Obama's acceptance from inside the basketball arena to outside at the football stadium, and all of a sudden 50,000 people, more people, can go watch this historic moment. The only problem is that political conventions, every hotel room from Colorado Springs to Boulder had already been reserved months and months earlier. So what were people going to do? They were going to start sleeping on each other's couches, and people, Denver residents who didn't want to be there for the convention, thought, oh, I'll rent out my apartment. Well, Airbnb was a great way to make people, to help facilitate that, right? And so this is the first of what we call these catalyzing events. We call them double trigger events, to try to point out that this is not the trigger that launches the product. This is the trigger that makes a lot of people aware of it. Sometimes it's not an event at all, though, right? Sometimes it's a platform. And in the interest of time, I won't spend a ton of time on this, but I think the eBay, PayPal, and MySpace, YouTube point out something really interesting here, which is sometimes, in the case of eBay and PayPal, right, both platforms continue to grow. But people have this problem on eBay, right, which is you finish an auction, and then you got to get the seller money. And pre-PayPal, right, how did you do it? You sent them a cashier's check or a check. You need to wait for that to clear, and then 7 to 10 days later, that clears, and then you send them the money. Right? It turns out emailing people money was a much more effective way to do it. There's some great stories as we were kind of putting together the PayPal case study that when the PayPal guys first watched this happen, they actually had a conversation for like 10 minutes about like, hey, should we shut down all these eBay users because they're ruining the way we really want them to use PayPal, right? Obviously, it ended up becoming a magical thing. In some cases, in the case of MySpace and YouTube, right, you use that platform to get to a certain point, and you keep growing, and that platform dies. That's fine. This is just a way to make a lot of people aware of this. I do this talk sometimes in front of lots of startups, and they go, well, all these are great, Sean. These are like great B2C examples, but none of this works for my company. I'm a SaaS company in the B2B space. I would actually argue that what HubSpot did with marketing agencies is basically the same thing. Right? You've got all these big platforms of networks of ad agencies, and solving a pulsating problem for them, and then ultimately becoming bigger than the platform that you served. Right? Sometimes these catalyzing events are not actually events, and they're not platforms. They're actually software. Right? So most of the things we discover today are recommended by algorithms. And these are all well-established ones, but the important point here is that a lot of those algorithms, right, when they first show up, people don't know how they make the recommendations they do. And the first people who figure that out when the algorithms emerge end up catalyzing a lot of awareness about their product or service. So 10 years ago, when Frank was doing his first Frank and Jen were doing their first conference, right, you could make a lot of money arbitraging Google. It's not quite as interesting a business today. So the interesting question here is not just what are the algorithms people are using to discover your products and service, but what are the emerging ones where maybe you can buy a bunch of attention relatively inexpensively. And then the last one is, the last catalyzing event is actually viral growth. So what about people telling other people about your product or service? And the point I always make here is lots of entrepreneurs take advantage of this viral growth thing, and we like to think that like we invented this, right? We like to think like we, the tech entrepreneurs, invented this. It turns out people have been telling people about products and services for a long, long time, right? A long, long time. The new part about it, though, is we can actually measure it. We can turn this into math problems, and we can take friction out of the process because we can do that, right? And so these are kind of the 4 techniques that you can do. And when you can, speaking to this last one, when you can measure it and optimize it, you can figure out things like how much money do I need to give somebody to get them to use my payment product? Or what is the exact text I should put at the end of the emails that I'm giving people to send out for free that will get people to sign up faster? And in the case of Hotmail, right, that means that you can spend virtually nothing on your free email service while your competitor spends tens of millions of dollars, and you can grow orders of magnitude faster than they do, right? Or more recently, right, how much free space do I need to give you to get you to invite your friends to my file storage system, right? And so once you go through these catalyzing events, then the last step of this 3-phase model is what are the best practices that you need to do to sustain that growth for the long haul. And I won't spend as much time on this just in the interest of time, because that is the high-class problem, right? Getting through steps 1 and 2 are challenging. The third step is certainly the rare air, but once you've changed the trajectory of your startup, right, the last question is how do you sustain and maintain that high growth for the long haul? And across the cases we looked at, we end up seeing 5 things that we continue to see over and over again that seem to be these kind of consistent trends on how people maintained that exponential growth in the long term. So how do they think about taking the existing networks that they'd built and maximizing the value of those? The second one down, maintaining discipline. One of the surprising things to me was having spent a lot of my career in the kind of first 2 of these buckets and then handing the reins over to growth investors who are, I think, even better at this. I had this intuition, which would be high growth companies look a lot like early stage companies, which is they're constantly running lots of experience, they have lots of things going on, and they're trying to scale those up. One of the things you see is that once you've experienced this rapid rate of growth, saying yes and becomes the enemy of those meetings. So when you go into a meeting and say, should we do A or B? And you say, yes, we should do both of them. That's a great attitude when you're searching for product market fit, you're trying to get that great first interaction. Once you're experiencing this rapid rate of growth, focus or discipline becomes a really important thing. And so you have stories about things like the founders of PayPal that will only talk to their direct reports about one thing at any given point in time. How do you recruit a high-performance team? So I don't know how many of you saw Frank's interview with the CEO of Context Media, but I thought the sort of things around culture and process from this morning really fed into this well. It's not that like the companies that failed didn't have high performers and the companies that did. It's that there was this sort of approach to recruiting and the processes that they used to do it that were, I think, really impressive, and we sort of spent a bunch of time talking about this in the course and then later in the book. The next one, I swear this is not just because I'm paid to invest in startups, but one of the things that LPs ask me all the time when I'm out fundraising is like, well, it's gotten so much cheaper to do a startup today, which is true. So when I did my first startup, we spent $2 million of the first $3 million we raised on servers and software, right? Like actual servers, not Amazon Web Service servers, but like actual servers we put in a data center. We sold those servers for pennies on the dollar, and when I sold that business to LinkedIn, I had a $500 a month credit card bill, right? So like the economics of doing startups has changed very dramatically. But one of the things you see when you look across these cases of companies is that in almost every case, once you start to scale and at that rapid rate, it's really challenging to do that just organically off of cash flow. And then the last of these being data-driven, or being data-informed, not data-driven. I think there's this impression, right, which is that you can use data to solve all problems. And the reality is you can use data to solve a lot of problems. But it's really kind of data plus human intuition, this sort of magical, if you think of it as a Venn diagram, sort of magical place where those two overlaps, that you can get to the kind of this highest caliber decision-making process. So we turned it into a course, spent a lot of time over the last few years teaching students kind of these practices, having them go use it to join high-growth companies that had raised millions of dollars. And then most recently, as in like April of this year, we turned it into a book, and people have been using it from all over the world. So it's been really cool to see the kind of content take on a life of its own. But if you're interested in sort of this framework and understanding more on more on the catalyzing events, and then a little bit more on the prerequisites and the long-term growth, you can get the book from Amazon or anywhere else. And hopefully it'll give you the tools you want to end up making the world the way the world ought to be, which is really, in my mind, still the most important thing any of us can do. So thanks for the time. Really appreciate it.